Namaskar and welcome back to Media Scan, your weekend dose of headlines, controversies and perspectives. A string of world leaders are visiting India, and in the midst of these high-profile visits, there's a lot of turbulence going on in our neighborhood, political as well as economy. So what do all these developments mean for our country and for the people is what we are going to discuss in our show this evening. But first up, what made news? Referring to the Ukraine-Russia conflict and related incidents, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that these developments have raised questions about the global order and therefore regional cooperation and regional security have assumed greater importance. PM Modi was addressing the BIMSTEC forum earlier this week. Welcoming the framing of the BIMSTEC Charter, the Prime Minister said this was an important step and called for greater cooperation in entrepreneurship and startups. A string of world leaders have visited and are visiting India these days, from the Chinese Foreign Minister to the German NSA to the US Deputy NSA, the UK Foreign Secretary, Russian Foreign Minister, Nepal Prime Minister and more. India is being courted by countries on both sides of the global spectrum to tilt one way or the other on the Ukraine question. New Delhi, however, is standing firm and sticking to its neutral position. India is also rising up to the occasion by providing leadership and encouraging regional cooperation at a time when many of our neighbors are facing severe political and economic crisis. Good news for the Northeast. After detailed deliberations, Union Home Minister Amit Shah announced this week that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act would be lifted from 36 districts of Northeast India, spreading over Assam, Manipur and Nagaland. So, these districts will not be disturbed areas anymore. The news brought cheer to people of the region, and chief ministers of all the states have welcomed it wholeheartedly. Activists who have been demanding that AFSPA be lifted completely in the Northeast also welcomed it as a first step in the right direction. In an obvious reference to the recent incidents of political violence and clashes in the Assembly, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said it was our duty that if there was anarchy and violence anywhere, it must be opposed. He was speaking virtually at a congregation of the Matua Dharma Mahamela 2022, organized at the famous Thakurbadi in West Bengal on the occasion of the 211th birth anniversary of Shri Shri Horichand Thakur. PM said, if people are using violence for their political differences, then it is a suppression of democratic rights and must be opposed. The PM's remarks came just days after the ghastly Birbhum massacre in which 8 people, including children, were charred to death in what is reported to be a case of political rivalry within the TMC ranks. States have the right to declare linguistic and religious groups as minorities if they are lesser in numbers, though the courts should refrain from doing so. This was stated clearly by the central government while responding to a notice by the Supreme Court. The Apex Court was hearing a petition filed by Advocate Ashwini Upadhyay, who has argued that Hindus who were in a minority in Jammu Kashmir and some other states were denied the benefits of a minority as they were not declared as one. In a related development, Assam Chief Minister Himanta Biswa Sharma has demanded that minority must be decided on a district level and not just the state. He said he would be filing an affidavit in this regard in the Supreme Court. So those were the headlines you saw dominating the media space over the week. Certainly a very hot news week. But now, viewers, I want to come to what is happening in our neighborhood as well as in the Eurasian situation. As we already flagged to you, there has been a string of world leaders visiting India and are still around who are trying to impress upon us their own point of view, their own standpoint of the situation regarding the global developments. It started with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. We still have the Russian Foreign Minister on our land. Then there was the US Deputy NSA, the German NSA, the British Foreign Secretary. Nepalese Prime Minister, our neighbor, is here. Meanwhile, we have had a very fruitful and interesting BIMSTEC conference as well. In the midst of all these very interesting global developments, India so far has stood firm in its position when it comes to Ukraine-Russia conflict and related issues. Meanwhile, there is a lot of turbulence in the neighborhood. Whether we look at the economic crisis which is faced by Sri Lankans, the political upheaval in Pakistan, similar developments in the Maldives, and also a kind of conflict in the economic situation in Nepal. So in the midst of all this, where does New Delhi stand? How are we going to stand our ground and rise up to the occasion as a leader in the subcontinent as well as on the international arena? To understand these complex and very important issues, I have here with me this evening a very distinguished panel of guests who will help us to decipher, to understand which way the things are likely to go and how India should maintain its position of fierce neutrality, its responsibility as a global leader. Allow me to introduce my first guest for the evening. I have here with me Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, a well-known face in the media, also a well-known author. He has served the country as ambassador, as envoy in various parts of the globe, and we are happy to have him here on Media Scan. Welcome and good evening, Ambassador Gurjeet Singh.
Good evening.
Also with me, someone you are very familiar with on the social media, one of the better known faces, known to speak his mind on issues of geostrategy, on internal security, on terror, a well-known author, Sushant Sareen, my second guest for the evening. Welcome to Media Scan, sir, and we are very happy to have both of you gentlemen for the first time on our show.
Thanks for having me.
I come to the first question for the evening, and as I was saying, Ambassador Singh, I would like to put my first question to you, sir. We have been observing and we have been reading, and I'm sure you have, like all of us, seen how world leaders are, trying to make a string of visits to India, and certainly it is an effort to impress upon us their own point of view of the Eurasian situation. At the same time, trying to convince us that we must give up our neutrality and tilt to either this side or that. And that is why, interestingly, we have leaders who are on the two extreme sides of the spectrum. But then they are visiting India at the same time. They are here in New Delhi meeting Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, etc. In the midst of all this, sir, do you think it is going to become tougher for us to maintain our position in the coming days? Which way would you see it go?
Thank you, Ms. Mishra. Well, we live in interesting times.
Yes.
And, the entire globe is going through a series of collisions over the last 2 years, which have altered the dynamics on how countries cooperated. The pandemic created one collision. I think Afghanistan was another collision, and now there is Ukraine.
Yes.
Now, all of these challenge every country and how they deal with others. One of the biggest challenges is that many of us who were told that globalization is the panacea for all your ills suddenly find that selective use of supply chains and now selective use of sanctions actually disrupts globalization for the political good of some people. In the middle of all this, there is India with this strategic autonomy, what you call neutrality. I prefer to call strategic autonomy. Now,
right.
It is this strategic autonomy which some people wish to challenge, some people wish to emulate, and others wish to take advantage of. So in this large list of guests that India has hosted in the last few weeks, there are these three kinds. I mean,
so
there is the
if I may
American...
intervene, sir, if I may intervene your thoughts for a second, would you like to name or point out which are those who would like to challenge our autonomy and which are those who are looking at taking advantage of our position?
So I think the United States is one country which would like India firmly on its side. And they would interpret our strategic autonomy as leaning towards them and against Russia, whereas our preference is to work with them where China is concerned. The second lot weighs the countries mainly of Europe and also I would say Japan and Australia, who, while following the American lead because of an absence of strategic autonomy at the present moment, would nevertheless like to be like India, more autonomous. And I think they do say what the Americans want them to say, but then privately I think they quite agree with us that you have to find a via media and you cannot exclude Russia from the portals of the world. And I think the third area...
For the benefit of our viewers, sir, if you can explain a little better, we know that broadly most of Europe and countries like Japan and Australia are on the same page as the US, but then we do enjoy a one-on-one relationship with each one of them, don't we? Which includes Australia, of Japan of late, France, Germany, where you yourself have served a very successful stint. So how do you explain this complexity in the picture?
You're very right. So what happens is that due to the current pressures of the Ukraine crisis, friends of India like Japan, Australia, Germany, France and others are basically speaking about the American wish to have sanctions because some of them are part of the G7 consensus on it.
Yes.
But when they speak to us bilaterally, it is evident that they want to expand the bilateral relationship as per the existing agenda and post-pandemic want to put speed into it rather than derail it on Ukraine. But strategically, they do want to say what the Americans also would like them to say. Therefore, you see this dichotomy in a more public pronouncement and a more private pronouncement. In fact, I think the British Foreign Secretary perhaps exemplified it the most because they are very pro-American, but during her visit she was very careful not to lecture India and also to seek a closer partnership as per the roadmap which India and the UK are developing. So I think that is correctly.
I get your point, sir, point taken, but just allow me to bring in Sushant Sareen also here into the discussion now. Mr. Sareen, we saw some very strong statements from the US President and it was followed up by some similar statements by the Deputy NSA Dalip Singh when he visited here. But, you know, as Ambassador Singh is pointing out to us that on a bilateral basis, people have been mostly careful to be more understandable of our position, more sensitive to our concerns. But then in the last 3, 4, 5 days, sir, do you think it has just become a little tougher for India to maintain the position that it has been fiercely maintaining for the past several weeks? How do you think it going from here?
So, look, personally, I think, you know, I have a big problem with concepts like neutrality and strategic autonomy. No country in the world is fully strategically autonomous, and neutrality, I strongly believe in what Dante wrote, that the worst place in hell is reserved for those who matters of grave moral crisis observe a position of neutrality.
So now, can we say that our position is based on our own interest? Forget the question of neutrality, if you may.
Precisely. So I don't think we should even mouth the term neutrality or strategic autonomy while dealing with countries. We should simply talk about where our interests are served and we should go for that. Number one. Number two, we should be able to identify what our interests are. If our interest is that we must be able to, you know, stand up on our own and we must show the other countries that we don't need them, I don't think that serves our interest. But that's my view. I think our interest has to be how do we increase our national power, how do we improve the lives of our people, how do we improve our economy, how do we attract business and finance into India, how do we generate employment in India, how do we defend ourselves. I think those are what our interests have to be. Our interests are not you know, to stand up to somebody just to show that we are a very powerful country.
So therefore,
I think that's a very
when we are dealing with a Russian dignitary and trying to establish a one-on-one, trade relationship due to the sanctions, and there is another country which says you will have to face consequences, how do you see things panning out?
So Smita, here is the thing. I think, if we are a self-assured country, we should stop tilting at the windmills. And frankly, I, for one, at least prefer the Americans who talk straight, talk candidly, and talk frankly, even in public. It might sound jarring at times, but I prefer that to what the British Foreign Secretary is saying, because the British say something in public and do something entirely different and conspiratorial behind your backs. And we know how the British have always done us down on a range of issues. They have always done us down. The Americans will tell you before they do you down. The Brits don't behave like that. So I prefer the candidness with which the Americans are talking, number one. Number two, I don't think we heard anything harsh from the Americans so far. What did the Deputy National Security Advisor say? He said something which is American policy. He didn't say that we are going to impose sanctions on you. He said, look, if you are going to do this, there will be certain consequences which will be there for every other country. Number one. Number
this
two,
was seen, in bracketed with the US president's comment which came earlier that India is looking shaky when you look at the other Quad countries,
again,
which is yes.
Smita, that is precisely what I meant. When the US president said, you have to look at you can't just pluck out a word and say that the American president was targeting us. No, he wasn't.
Fine.
He was talking about the EU, which was standing very firm. He was talking about the Quad, and 3 out of the 4 countries are standing on one way. And he said on some of the things, India is a bit shaky. What does that mean? It means nothing. And we reacted like petulant children. Why has he called us shaky? Are we such a weak and do we lack so much of assurance in ourselves, in our own ability, that every time somebody uses a word like shaky, we actually become shaky? So I think we should show a degree of equanimity, we should show a degree of assuredness, and we should deal with countries. And let me tell you one thing, before you go back to Ambassador Singh, let me just say one thing. Look, even though we have been dealing with the Russians, most of our partners in the West understand our predicament, understand some of the compulsions we face, and have not really pushed us the way they have pushed some of the other countries.
That is fair, because the Germans, the French, all of them have been sensitive, and they have said it in so many words that they do understand our positioning. But then, since you reminded, I have to bring back Ambassador Singh here. Ambassador Singh, first, a quick reaction, or do you really think we have conducted ourselves like petulant children, as to quote Sushant Sareen?
No, before Ambassador Singh comes, I didn't say that complete. We as India, it's not the government which has conducted itself petulantly. I think the way the media has reacted has been like very petulant and very puerile.
Thank you. And since this is Media Scan, Ambassador Singh, we always like to take the media's treatment of important issues. We had done the Western world's media's treatment of our positioning on Ukraine in our last episode, one of our more fruitful discussions. But coming back here, do you think our media has been sort of jumpy in its reaction, knee-jerk, and shouldn't have jumped at certain words the way it has? Because these are issues which must be seen in entirety. Quickly, sir.
So, yes, Ms. Mishra, in a 24/7 news broadcast era, media tends to grasp at every windmill, as Sushant says, and sometimes the windmill is not quite churning. So I wouldn't like to go further into that. Let me try and explain this, taking off from where Mr. Sareen left off. Every statement of a leader has a context, but it also has a public and a private context. Now, when you had President Biden at the virtual Quad summit, he did not say India is shaky. He said it, as Sushant said, in a different context. Similarly, there are others who have said things about India, but in a wider context, but when they come to us, I think they are more circumspect, because all said and done, they know that Ukraine or no Ukraine, we want a relationship with India which is beyond Ukraine. That, I think, is the crux of the matter.
Correct.
Now,
I believe that is where we need to stop it here, sir, because, I know this is a much larger subject to discuss, and we have been doing it in successive episodes. But right now, I want to come back closer home and looking at the goings on in our Western neighbor, but also there are developments with the economic situation in Sri Lanka. We read a lot about it during the BIMSTEC conference, and our External Affairs Minister was there. And then we have the Nepalese Prime Minister coming here, who has his own set of issues going on. So how do you look at India conducting itself in these challenging situations in the subcontinent? Most importantly, the upheaval in Pakistan, our effort to handhold Sri Lanka, but then there is the Chinese question troubling there. Similarly, likewise in Nepal too. How would you put these in your own words, sir? And have we stood up to the situation, really?
Again, the situation around us is neither of our making nor opportune for us. We could do with a more stable neighborhood.
Yes.
Same, now you mentioned two countries which are having problems in our neighborhood. Leave Pakistan away, that's a different problem. We are not trying to bail Pakistan out. With the other neighbors, I think there is a broad thinking in India that yes, we will stand by you, but you too need to stand with us. It is no more going to be a one-way street.
Absolutely.
If you want to play the China card at your will, then you play it when you are in trouble too and see what happens. What is the lesson of Ukraine? Don't get pumped up by distant friends to take on neighbors. Ultimately, you will get hurt. I think that is the simple lesson.
On that point, is that realization happening somewhere? Considering what we saw in Sri Lanka, a lot has happened during these days, but considering our projects going on with them and the developments in Jaffna and this recent summit, do you think somewhere that realization has started setting in, or this is work in progress?
I think it's still a band-aid solution to a major wound. And I think some of our neighbors still believe that the ultimate surgery will be performed by China, whereas the fracture is they have created. So you cannot fix fractures with band-aids. I think it needs a longer-term commitment, which India, I think, has maturely said we will do. But we are not kind of bending over backwards to do everything which they require, but we are doing enough to sustain them. And if they think there are other people who can help them stand on one leg, well, I think this is the time for them to call upon them.
Right. So the onus is obviously more on our neighbors because we have already done our bit and we are very much there. So on that note, I'll have to bring in Sushant Sarin here because I have very few minutes left with me. And this time this is on Pakistan because nobody speaks his mind as well as Sushant Sarin does. So, sir, Imran Khan has been with great bravado, he has announced that in all his life, he is known to play till the last ball. Fair enough, but you know better. And also, with these upheavals going on in the Western neighbor, how do you see the portents for our country?
No, frankly, I think upheavals in our Western neighbor are very good. I, for one, do not subscribe to this because I find it mind-boggling every time any Indian says that a peaceful, stable Pakistan is in India's best interest. Whenever Pakistan has been stable, it has always been a thorn in our flesh. It is better for them to be unstable and fighting among themselves rather than creating trouble in India. So I don't buy this.
So are you saying good for us? Is that what you are saying?
Yeah, but I frankly, as long as they keep involved in their own the mess which is of their own making, I don't see why it should bother us. Number one. Number two, how does a change of face really make any difference to us? Okay, you might not have an abusive and vulgar, vile man like Imran Khan in power, but you will have another stooge of the Pakistan army in power. So what does that change in substantive terms between India and Pakistan. The fundamental problems which afflict the relationship between the two countries will remain in place. You might have a different style, but the substance of that relationship does not change. So how does it make any difference to us?
I get your point, sir, that when it comes to Indo-Pak relations, you know, the more things change, the more they seem to remain the same. But I do have one observation here very quickly, because I have very little time left with me this evening. I have seen that every time there is a new incumbent in the Pakistan regime, he or she has to, you know, it seems like they have to prove themselves that much more. And it starts with bad-mouthing and abusing India first. As if their bad-mouthing India is going to be the criterion for their own, you know, proving their position or mettle.
Yeah, that is true. But somebody like a Shahbaz Sharif is not somebody who's just come in from nowhere. He's been there for a very long time. His family has been in power for, on and off for the last 30 years.
Yes.
So he might not, really badmouth India the way Imran Khan was doing. But I don't see him changing, or making a paradigm shift in Pakistan's policy towards India. And frankly, I hope and I pray that we don't make the mistake that we often make, that every time somebody says pleasant lies from Pakistan, we fall for it. Those beguiling words actually beguile us. I think we should have a set of metrics, 5 or 10 of them, on the basis of which we will judge Pakistan whether they are actually serious in moving forward in their relationship with us or not. I think this business of, oh, that guy has issued such a nice statement, General Bajwa has said such a nice thing, so maybe we should try it out. That's the most foolish way to run Pakistan policy of India. Let General Bajwa or whoever is in charge, let them do something substantive. Like I said, 5 or 10 things which we have in mind, that look, if you do this, then this, and then this, then we will do this. Not this business case, you issue a statement and, we are back to puppies and jappies. I think we've done enough of that, and
Understood.
It has not worked.
Understood, sir, and I think that point is well taken. We have our own set of experiences in that, so fair enough. But then I wish we could have carried on this conversation a little longer to understand the complexities, more particularly in the global situation. But I'm afraid that is all the time I have. So thank you very much, Sushant Sarin, because we have contacted you at very short notice, but you found the time to join our show and explain those things to us. Also, thank you very much, Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, for interacting with us, and we'll try to get back to both of you gentlemen in our later episodes as we deal with more such complex but important issues on Media Scan. Thank you, sir. With that interesting and very clearly spoken words from both our guests, it's time to wrap up Media Scan for this evening. But viewers, do keep watching DD India as we shall continue to scan the media for you. Good night.